Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this webinar on the Better Alignment Project interim findings. Thank you for joining us today, either in your morning or your evening or your afternoon. My name is Wim Bartels. I'm the presenter of today of the findings during the project. I am the project manager of the Better Alignment Project, working closely with the people of CDP, CDSB, GRI, Integrated Reporting Council, and SASB. And the five of us have worked over the past more than half a year on both the technical side and the communications side. And today we're going to share with you the results and also hear from the experts from the participating partners on their views of the project so far, what they learned from it, and how they will take it from here. On the first slide that we're going to present to you, you'll see an overview of the experts. Nicole Dandu of CDP, David Astley of CDSB, Sarah Jane, Dominique of GRI, Lisa French of the IIRC, and David Parham of SASB. I've checked in the list of attendees and they all appear to be there, so you'll hear them later in the webinar. If during this webinar at any time you have a question or a comment, please use the chat box. It's on your screen, and then you can type it in there, and then later on in this webinar we will address it assuming time allows. We had another webinar today, and we were able to answer any questions, so please don't hesitate. I wanted to start with taking you back to the corporate reporting dialogue and its overall purposes. And you see it here on screen. When the CRD started in 2014, it was established to drive further coherence, to drive further consistency, and drive further comparability between the frameworks. And the background of that was that by that time, there were, at least at the global scale, 8 frameworks that worked on either financial or non-financial reporting or a combination of both, and that created confusion a little between them, a little in the market, and that was the whole purpose to setting up the CRD. So we're now in existence for 5 years, and we started the Better Alignment Project in November 2018. And also that project had a specific purpose, namely to drive a better alignment of the framework specifically for ESG and sustainability reporting, and creating, as it's called, a paradigm shift towards the integration of financial and non-financial information. When I share later in this call the results from the survey as well as from the roundtables that we've held, you'll see that the integration is seen by many as very relevant nowadays already, but also in the years to come. The project itself is a 2-year project, and in year 1 we agreed with our funders to effectively do 4 things. Overall, I should say first of all that this first year is primarily a mapping exercise. So the actual alignment, and I'll come back to it, is not intended to be realized in this year, apart from the possibility of that at all, and I'll share a few insights on that later on. But we agreed to do a global market consultation in order to test with the market whether carriers want. We agreed to do the mapping, as I already said, and decided to take the TCFD as the basis for that in order to have a limited and overseeable scope of the project in this first year, as we would not only map the frameworks against the TCFD, but also against each other. Then thirdly, we would look into how non-financial metrics relate to financial outcomes and how that can be integrated in mainstream reports, and all of that will result in a public report on potential areas for a future alignment. That report, I should say yet already, is due September 2019. Then in year 2, we agreed to look into wider mapping of the ESG sustainability information between the frameworks. And if you're familiar with the reporting frameworks, to some extent you already understand that there's a high complexity in it, and therefore we decided together with the funders to split it in two phases. And we have learned a lot. You'll hear from that later in this webinar from this first year already. The aims of the project, four clear aims, I think, to reduce reporting fatigue. Many in the market said before we started the project, we have to respond to so many requests and it's all not aligned. How can we make that better with that enabling effective reporting, and from the financial perspective, from the investor's perspective, to drive capital in the right direction of sustainable development, also in light of the changing nature of risk and opportunities, and therefore having the right reporting mechanisms would also allow to align markets to that changing nature. The process, as said, consisted of two elements essentially. One was to look at the technical mapping, the other is to reach out to the market and inform them as well as get their feedback. So we reached out to the market over the past, as you can see, about 3 months. We had over 250 stakeholders participating in the survey and or the roundtables. And the survey that was directed both to preparers and users with different questions ran for 6 weeks, followed by, but overlapping a little, by stakeholder roundtables in all regions of the world, as you can see on the bottom of your screen. So in Europe, 5 countries. In Asia too, we covered Australia, the Americas, and also South Africa. So with that, I think it's fair to say that we covered all relevant regions of the world and did our best to get the feedback from the market. When we look at the key findings of the surveys first, then it's maybe good to start with the relevance of the work we're doing. So we asked whether TCFD is relevant for preparers and users, and yes, a majority said we are reporting on the TCFD, or we're intending to do so in the next years to come. And from the investors' perspective, we are already using it for investment analysis, although that is yet to a limited extent. As important, I think, is that users are increasingly linking ESG information to financial performance, to assess financial performance of companies, and the preparers are increasingly integrating ESG information in their annual report in a certain manner. Then also the respondents said in the next 5 years we'll see a broadened scope of ESG information and further increasing integration with financial information. That all is just confirming that what we are doing here is most relevant and important to the market. Then based on, I think, approximately 15 to 20 questions per group, we highlighted the issues, and on our next slide you only see a summary of everything that we received in terms of feedback, and that were highlighted by the respondents as being on the complementarity and the appropriateness of differences between the frameworks given their audiences and different focus. And interestingly, there are differing views amongst the respondents. So some say it is clear to us, others say it is not clear at all. And these differing views has led us to the conclusion that we need to provide clarification so that all can say we understand how the frameworks fit together and how they could work together. And we will do that intendedly at the highest level, so at the level of indeed audience focus, and a way of reporting and a brief description of the type of and nature of each framework, so that that becomes clearer than it apparently is today. Then a few issues being highlighted. One relates to different definitions of materiality that seem to be existing, at least in the eyes of the respondents. When we look from a technical perspective at materiality, we essentially come to the conclusion that every framework is looking at it in a similar way, but the differences highlighted here relates primarily to the focus on investors on the one hand, or wider stakeholders and or society on the other hand. So this is an area where not only further clarification, but also further alignment is apparently needed. The whole start of this project was based on the differences at the indicator level, and we see that coming back as a real issue indeed. The differences in measures and methodologies has been highlighted as an issue by the respondents to the survey, and that means that we have to look for alignment at indicator level. The users, specifically being investors primarily, had a desire to work on the terminology, so they highlighted that the different terminology creates issues with them to clearly and easily understand the information. And then climate change reporting was highlighted as a key issue to be sorted out, as the key priority, if you like, that not only defines or confirms the relevance of the work we're doing, but also suggests that this is a specific area where further alignment is urgently needed. And then finally, the respondents said, we're interested in the links between financial ESG and financial performance and financial prospects, as well as strategy, or more financially oriented, if you like, but also how ESG information links to achieving the sustainable development goals, which is the society or wider stakeholder lens that I was referring to earlier. And that not only requires further clarification, but also further guidance, is the conclusion that we have drawn. So these are on one slide the results from the survey. Then stepping into the round tables, where we deepened the discussion, we asked about 4 topics, and we did so in 12 cities around the world, as you saw, in 13 round tables. So we asked not only, as we did for the survey, about the current level of alignment, but also how they see the connectivity and reuse of reported information, whether they understand the benefits and the complementarity of the participants' frameworks, and what they see as next steps for the CRD. The key findings from the roundtables I'm going to share with you, split over 2 slides. This is the first one. As from coming from the survey, the participants in the roundtable said the relationships between the frameworks, the interconnections, how they align, that is all not well articulated, and we need to better understand that. So that completely aligns with the results from the survey. There was also in the discussions at the roundtables a call to achieve really alignment towards a single all-encompassing framework. As I hope I have explained in the beginning, this current state and working on the basis of all the information that is in the current frameworks, and not in any regard going beyond that, this call is apparently asking for going further than the project that we are currently running. Also, there was a clear call for harmonization and support for an agreed and shared language and taxonomy. That is not unsurprising. I think it is maybe confirming what the survey already said, that there is also this confusion about the different definitions of materiality, and I shared the details of that earlier in this call. Then there was a request to give more attention to sector-specific reporting, apparently demonstrating that in the eyes of the participants, the current more generic reporting requirements do not serve everyone sufficiently prepare as end users. And there was an ask for further attention for reporting by small and medium-sized enterprises, where the current disclosure requirements are mainly focused on large listed companies. On the next slide, I share with you 4 further findings. The first is that in relation to indicators, again confirming that the work we're doing is most relevant, that at the level of indicators, there is a need for more comprehensive and better aligned indicators also to financial impact. And that all is based on the growing understanding of the financial impact of ESG information resulting in risk and opportunities. There was a clear appreciation for the importance of the TCFD recommendations. This regards mainly the TCFD framework, not so much the CRD directly, but as many delegates said, we struggle to report, especially on scenario analysis, which is, as I think most of you will know, is the, call it, new recommendation, the new reporting recommendation from the TCFD. Then, and this I will highlight later on again, but there was lots of comments on the wealth of indexes, questionnaires, surveys, and other frameworks that ask for disclosure of ESG information and data. And as preparers said, who are reporters will recognize this point. I think this is already a moment to say that whereas the CRD is working with 5 frameworks on better alignment between them, we should also recognize, and we realized ourselves during the project, whereas there is work to do at the global level between 5 exclusively that create the confusion in the market. There are many more out there. There are over 1,500 we learned from the WBCSD that require disclosures that are somewhat different or somewhat additional or with a somewhat different definition, and that further contributes to the confusion. There is a need for alignment. Finally, there was also a call for a regulatory solution in the roundtables. So it was said by participants that the voluntary frameworks and standards that we're talking about here would be a temporary fix for a problem that is different and would only be solved by a regulatory solution. Before I say anything in relation to that, I think it's good to understand that this project, again, is about mapping and looking at opportunities for alignment, not for the actual alignment itself. As the framework organizations clearly explained, all of them, is that they have their own governance processes, their own governance structure, their own due process for updating their frameworks, and therefore just not a possibility within the context of how the organizations operate. An overview of the project is on your screen. We had a technical work stream looking at mapping the frameworks to the TCFD and between them with agreeing on the level of alignment as the final result of that, and the communication and stakeholder outreach work stream that I just explained to you the results from. All of this will result in a year 1 report that will be released by September. It will be published in New York at the UN Climate Week or during the UN Climate Week. And by then we will have a report that will explain to what extent the frameworks are aligned or aren't, and where the potential misalignments are, and what would be opportunities to resolve these. And let me step in a little more detail for these, and give you an update on the outcomes of the technical team's work. And as you saw on the previous screen, we looked at both the principles, the recommendations of the TCFD, so the 11 shown on the one page by the TCFD, and the example indicators that the TCFD has in its guidance for the non-financial sectors, and also a few indicators for the financial sectors. First of all, we looked into the principles and concluded that the frameworks are essentially unified on the principles. And why is this so important? It was very important for us to make sure that we did not have any conflict at the level of reporting principles, because that would create much bigger issues than aligning at indicator level. But fortunately, the conclusion was the frameworks are unified. Now, those of you on the webinar would say it could be, but still, you know, when I read them, they're all different. That regards language, that regards terminology, that regards detail of explanation. What we mean to say here is that in terms of the content and the meaning, the frameworks are unified. Secondly, we looked into the frameworks against the TCFD disclosure recommendations, and we concluded that collectively the frameworks cover these disclosure recommendations. There are some limited gaps, some exist around scenario analysis, for example, but in total, the frameworks cover the TCFD disclosure recommendations. That means that preparers can use the frameworks, look at the relevant TCFD recommendation that they want to disclose against, and be able to apply a specific framework for that purpose. We will publish an overview by participating framework of the elements of that framework against the TCFD. So you will have a full overview if you report against GRI or CDSB or SASB, doesn't matter, on how you could apply that framework when reporting against the TCFD, and to what extent it is aligned, or what you should count with if you want to do a full, be fully in accordance with the TCFD and applying that specific framework. Then we realized that when we talk about alignment, and we did so specifically on the indicators, and I should share a little more on that, I think that there are, first of all, historical differences. There are inherent differences in terms of the audience and focus, but also in terms of the way that the framework of the organizations have structured their frameworks, and that's not easily changed, as you can imagine. Also, the level of detail, the language used is different due to the history of each of the frameworks, also due to the jurisdiction that each of the frameworks is in. And therefore, the conclusion was that with the frameworks, if we move to alignment, there is no essential misalignment that is expected to be limited, but it will be a long-term process to really get the alignment where essentially you would have the same outcome as that one framework that some of the participants in the roundtables asked for. We came to this when we looked into the indicators, and when we come out with a report, we will provide an overview of, for all of the TCFD example indicators, to what extent there is misalignment between the frameworks or where there isn't. And that will provide preparers with an insight when you use multiple frameworks on what you should do additionally if you want to apply both of them, and to what extent or where there is some substantive misalignment. In that same overview, we will also provide an overview for each of the TCFD example indicators to where you can find the relevant information in each of the frameworks, and to what extent they align with that specific TCFD recommended disclosure. Indicator, I should say. So we will provide that as an annex to the report to serve preparers and users, and that will also be the basis for further future alignment in terms of technical basis. I should also say here, I think already that whereas there is confusion in the market, there is a perception that there is much misalignment. Our conclusion will be that misalignment is relatively limited. Not to say that the market voice shouldn't be heard, of course, but to say that from a technical perspective, the misalignment is limited, and we hope to clarify that with the report and the annexes. Finally, on alignment opportunities, we also saw that there are, and concluded that there are alignment opportunities that are not so much within the framework and focus on the content, but go beyond that and are more at the organizational level. We are discussing that at this moment between the frameworks, and hopefully, potentially, will come out with some of those opportunities in the report that will be released in September. Let me conclude with a few key takeaways before I ask each of the participants from the framework organizations to give their views and insights. So as I already said, and I want to emphasize, confusion exists, but confusion extends beyond the global frameworks. That is very important to realize. There is a clear urgency to resolve it, though, and there is a clear urgency to further align the frameworks if we listen to the market's views and comments. The corporate reporting dialogue has started its work already back in 2014 to work on further coherence, consistency, comparability. But this Better Alignment project is the first project where work is done at the technical team level and is driving further alignment, I would almost say, in itself. My personal perception is that the impact of this project goes far beyond the content that we are going to deliver, and has created better collaboration. But we'll hear from the framework representatives in a second. It will be a long-term process, as I just explained, and there are further opportunities, but they go beyond the current content and will be more at the organizational level. With that, I would like to end my introduction. If you have any questions or comments, please feel invited to use the chat, and we will respond to these later on. But now I'm very pleased to welcome the 5 representatives that are on screen: Nicole, David, Sarah Jane, Lisa, and David. For some of them, it's very early. For others, it's a little early, but as it is the second time, it is a hard day, David Parham. But maybe as I name you now, David, why don't I start with you and ask SASB's perspectives on this project, your learnings, your insights, and anything else you want to share to our attendees of today.
Great, thank you so much, and really appreciate the opportunity to join you as well as my colleagues at CDP, IIRC, CDSB, and GRI on this webinar this morning for me. So a few things I'd love to share and touch on. First, in terms of following up to what was just shared around the consultation that we all participated in, I'll just echo what was said by Vim, and that the market voice has really been very helpful to our team, the Better Alignment project team, in highlighting how our work can be most helpful and useful to our constituencies. So, for example, it's great to hear ways in which the participant frameworks can help to reduce the confusion in the marketplace around the relationships that exist between our frameworks, as well as how information can be reused or repurposed across the different frameworks. Again, speaking to Vim's earlier point around especially indicators, principles, and of course the disclosures as well. I think it's also great to see how our technical work, and especially that the indicators mapping work that I mentioned, is really responsive to that feedback. So I'm very much looking forward to the launch of the final report, which will really help to highlight these outcomes, and hopefully will be a very practical and useful tool for stakeholders. In terms of our experience so far at SASB, it's really been a privilege to be able to work alongside our colleagues at IIRC, CDSB, GRI, and CDP, and to dive in and analyze each of the frameworks in depth. I think for us, it really highlighted how all of our frameworks can fit together and how each framework can be helpful to reporters in accomplishing their objectives, as well as to users of that information seeking to make decisions based on that information. I think it's also valuable that we were able to uncover and highlight areas of commonality as well as difference, and we're happy to see that many areas of our frameworks were already well aligned, as well as some key opportunities for further alignment as well. In terms of plans for the project going forward, I'm excited to continue to work collaboratively with the participating frameworks. Really, this is building on an experience that we've had collaborating in the past with each of the participating organizations throughout the development of the SASB standards in our framework, even prior to this project. But the Better Alignment project has really helped us to build a strong technical foundation to expand this collaborative work, hopefully to the benefit of all organizations, as well as stakeholders and users of our frameworks. In the near term, we're focusing on working with the team, of course, to finalize the report out that will occur in September of this year, which, as I mentioned, really does address a lot of the feedback that was discussed on this call. But beyond that, really looking forward to continuing to work with all the project participating organizations on the next phase of the project, which will really go beyond what we've done so far in terms of mapping to the TCFD and really allow us to dive into the rest of our frameworks. So that's what I wanted to share, and thank you very much, Vim, for the opportunity to join the webinar.
Thank you, David. Thank you very much. Sarah Jane, are you ready to come in and share GRI's insights and learnings?
Hi, Vim. Hopefully you can hear me. Thanks to you. And thanks for David to giving a good overview of the work and the collaboration that each of us has put in to date. From GRI's perspective, we have learned a lot during this first phase of the project and really relish the opportunity to work with the other organisations and truly understand their frameworks and standards and how it interrelates with ours. And echo a lot of what David said. And we think the September report will be really useful in highlighting the different approaches and purposes of the frameworks. And I think this awareness is very critical for both reporting organizations and users of the reports. Where we do overlap in terms of indicators and reporting requirements, we hope that the publication will facilitate better understanding of those commonalities and differences. And I think that awareness and lack of transparency has generated this perceived confusion in the marketplace. And certainly looking to the future, conversations are ongoing about what the next steps will be. And we look to be part of those conversations. We are very happy to see that the project points to the need to continue this established practice that we have already had in place working with the other organizations, particularly from our standard setting processes. So we have worked with CDP before in terms of water and climate change when it comes to highlighting the linkage between the CDP questionnaire and our relevant topic-specific standards. We do have David, who is just speaking. He's been nominated to join one of our sector program project working groups. So we certainly are working with each other, and that's a point that I think is important to note. And finally, I think we take this opportunity to thank you, Wim, and others for setting up the webinar, but thanks to the others that have been involved in the project, and we look forward to continued collaboration.
Thank you very much, Sarah-Jane. Thank you. David of CDSB, you are, by the way, also one of the people working on the report, so you have multiple tasks in this project, but I would very much welcome your insights as a technical team member in this project.
Hi, Wim, thanks. So the findings of the consultation and roundtables in many ways reiterate what we at CDSB have been hearing from stakeholders globally in recent years. So preparers and users do struggle to make sense of how framework standards interconnect. They're facing challenges to get to grips with and implement the TCFD, and they need more assistance in equating ESG risks and opportunities to financial information. So we think it's great and positive that we can better communicate to the market how we, the 5 organizations, fit together and how our frameworks and standards can be used in a complementary way to implement the TCFD. In terms of our experience of the project so far, we've really enjoyed the project and working with the other technical teams, as well as building on our existing collaborations, which David and Sarah-Jane have kind of sketched out. So entering into the dialogue and constructive technical mapping has really ingrained a deeper understanding of each other's outlooks, processes, and resources that we have available to the market. And then, in our opinion, this has created a positive basis for continued collaboration and alignment of our frameworks and standards, both within the Better Alignment project itself and outside of it on a more individual basis. And in terms of projects and plans going forward, so CDSB, in relation to the results of the first phase of the Better Alignment project, are looking into how we can better explain to the market how the principles and disclosure requirements of the TCFD can be extended and applied to other aspects of environmental reporting beyond climate, especially with the use of the CDSB framework. And then in addition to that, we'll be continuing our collaborative work with the other organizations. So for instance, we have a number of projects going forward with SASB at the moment, which are related to promoting the adoption of TCFD. So for example, we've recently released our implementation guidance, and in the next few months, we'll also be preparing a handbook showcasing good practice from around the G20. So those 2 projects will hopefully complement what's going to be happening with the Better Alignment project both this year and going forward.
Great, thank you very much, David. Thank you. Nicole of CDP, are you ready to come in and share the views of CDP on this project?
Hello, Wim. I'm here. Thank you.
Yes, go ahead. Thanks.
Yeah, I can start by reiterating how useful the exercise has been in raising our familiarity with the other frameworks and of course creating all the collaborative relationships and strengthening those. For me, I think the consultation shows that we need to do more to help companies understand how the frameworks fit together. Especially with supporting disclosure against the TCFD. I think what struck me most, however, is that need to work together is not just at the technical level that we've been focusing on in phase 1 of this project. I mean, we need to show how the frameworks fit together at the existential level as well, because I think that's where a lot of the confusion lies. And one of the main findings is that the market is confused by the reporting landscape itself, I think more so than with the technical granularity and differences between the frameworks. So we need to work together to help companies understand why we all exist separately in the way that we do. Related to that, I can say CDP is considering its position, for example, with regarding to our principles for reporting, and we're looking at an opportunity to have principles which more explicitly align with the other organisations. And I think by doing that, we will give more confidence in the market that the frameworks again are fundamentally aligned very well at the very core of what they're doing at the level of principles. So we are looking into that. On indicators, CDP will be reviewing where alignment can be improved so that we don't unnecessarily ask companies to collect different data for CDP disclosure. And as you mentioned, Vim, we did already find that the frameworks were pretty well aligned, in fact, in terms of their content. CDP has its own consultation exercise coming up, our annual consultation, so we welcome all feedback on how we can address any confusion that's out there through that consultation, especially for companies that using multiple frameworks. CDP's governance process is perhaps intentionally more flexible than the standards bodies, so we are able to review annually the data that we collect and respond with changes to our questionnaires. And respond to feedback we get where competing priorities allow, of course. And I think the other thing was, in particular, we should all be looking for opportunities to remove any unnecessary differences in terminology. I think that's coming through quite strongly as a sort of, it sort of hits above its weight really in terms of the confusion that it creates, where it's really only a matter of terminology. And then finally, on a couple of specific points that was causing confusion as came out in the consultation was TCFD alignment and scenario analysis. In 2018, CDP introduced a tagging in its questionnaires to show where there was alignment with the TCFD. So I just wanted to draw everyone's attention to that in our questionnaires. And we also introduced a technical note on scenario analysis, as we did recognise that this was something that many companies might be unfamiliar with. So I think that's what I've got to say at the moment about CDP's response to the consultation, and look forward to working forward on many of those points that I've mentioned. Thanks, Vim.
Thanks, Nicole. Thank you very much. Finally, last but not least, Lisa, the Chief Technical Officer of the IRC. You may have a somewhat special situation, as you're not only focused on ESG, but still very relevant, I think, in this project. Very interested to hear the IRC's views and perspectives on the project and also about the way forward, if possible.
Okay, great. Thank you, Vim. And thank you for calling me special, because that's how I heard that. Greetings to project partners. It's good to gather once again, and as always. If I could dive into the consultation findings, for me, one of the headline findings was respondents' view that our frameworks as they stand today aren't complementary at all. And that to me is obviously a bit disconcerting, because I think that we, and by we, I mean the participants of the Better Alignment Project, we know how and why our frameworks relate, and in some areas how they necessarily differ, based on scope considerations or purpose or audience considerations. But in hearing this direct feedback from the market, obviously the survey respondents are less conversant when it comes to these similarities and these differences. And so I think that, that feedback, it provided a very important reality check. It's not new to hear this, but I think it was, it really sort of underscored that point. And so we need to close this information gap between the project participants and the broader market. So that's a real big takeaway, from some of this feedback. I guess on a related note, and in terms of next steps, I think it is very important that we manage market expectations, particularly in terms of this word alignment. As we saw in the roundtable feedback, there's a call for, and I will use quotes here, a single all-encompassing framework. So clearly, some participants in the marketplace are interpreting the word alignment as meaning a very quick convergence of all standards and frameworks into a single reporting standard. And I think, you know, therein lies the importance of reinforcing the objectives of this project and what can be achieved within the timeline. So, you know, in practice, as we've already heard today, the Better Alignment Project will show how our standards and frameworks are, in the first instance, consistent with the final recommendations of the TCFD. And then in the project's second phase, we'll find opportunities to eliminate or to significantly reduce inconsistencies in terms of sustainability or ESG metrics, you know, metrics that go beyond climate change impacts and performance alone. And, you know, we'll look at how these metrics can be integrated into mainstream investor-oriented reports in the same way that the TCFD recommendations do. And it's this integration factor that's obviously of great interest to the IRC, chiefly because we think it's of interest to capital markets in terms of decision making. So in terms of our own experience in the project so far, yes, the technical analysis has been important, of course, and it's very interesting, but I'm kind of intrigued by the last two slides that Wim showed that speak of the opportunities that lie beyond the content of the frameworks themselves. And I think that's just as powerful. So at an organizational level, for example, can we better coordinate our due processes and our, you know, our individual timelines for framework revisions so that we can achieve a more cohesive and effective approach to improving alignment across the board? You know, and are there other opportunities for us to better come together? So I have to say that I find these aspects of the project pretty exciting as well. So I'll stop there, Wim. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lisa, and thank you for all of you for not only sharing your insights, but a kind of how would I say, converging your views, if I may use that word. There is a lot of commonality in what you say, not only in the level of collaboration and what you learn from it, but also where it needs to go. I think, Lisa, you clarified very strongly and very well that it is not an easy process. You know, from outside in, it is easy to ask. From inside out, it's not easy to realize. And that has nothing to do with willing it or not. It has to do with the due processes as you referred to. But as you also said, yes, there are opportunities to at other levels than just the content. And I think what we also shouldn't forget, and some of you also referred to that, and Juliet of IRC is leading on that, is that the communication, the explanation of how the frameworks fit together, work together, are complementary, how the indicators from each of the frameworks can be used for TCFD reporting will already help the mark expectedly to a significant extent, and therefore communication has been flagged, identified by the project partners as a key component going forward of the work. So we are considering to develop case studies on how you could navigate the landscape, how companies have done that, how they have found their way. We also have developed, I hope you have had a look at it already, the CRD website. It has been upgraded. It shows the latest information. This webinar, by the way, will be recorded and therefore can be listened to afterwards by you or any of your colleagues or affiliates. So please feel free to share that. And yes, that explanation in the right way about the individual purposes, but also about the joint vision is something that the COD will work on going forward. Thank you all for joining the webinar. But before you leave, I think it's good to announce one further publication of the full corporate reporting dialogue. We have looked at our common purpose, our common way to drive change in our own field, if you like, some in the financial reporting field, others in non-financial ESG or value creation. The paper, Understanding the Value of Transparency and Accountability, will be released shortly and will explain how the framework organization work on the basis of common principles, but also on the basis of a common vision. So please watch out for it. It will be published next week at corporatereportingdialogue.com. I'm sure it will also be shared via social media. Today's recording and slides will be shared also on corporatereportingdialogue.com, so you can always look back. Again, thank you very much for joining today, and I wish you a great continuation of your day.